You guys requested it, a deep dive on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and, well, things have gotten even more intense lately.
Yeah, it's really been blowing up in the news the past couple of weeks.
Seriously, with Iran now fully involved, it feels like we're on the edge of something much, much bigger.
Right, and it can feel impossible to keep up with it all.
Exactly. So before we even try to unpack what's happening now, we need to hit rewind, way back.
Absolutely. You can't understand what's happening today without understanding the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Exactly. So history in a hurry, then? What are the major historical milestones that have led us to this point?
Well, a good place to start is 1947. That's when the UN proposed dividing Palestine into two states.
One Jewish and one Arab.
Right. But this plan, instead of solving problems, actually ignited a war in 1948, the Arab-Israeli War.
And that's a major turning point, right? Because by the war's end, Israel had declared independence.
They did, but it came at a huge cost. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were displaced during the fighting. They call this period the Nakba, which means catastrophe.
And that term alone speaks volumes about how raw this history still is.
Totally. So then, fast forward to 1967, the Six-Day War.
Another huge turning point.
It was. Israel wins a decisive victory, gaining control of the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights.
A lot of ground to cover in just 6 days. I can see how this victory, while solidifying Israel's power, also created a whole new set of tensions over these territories.
You're exactly right. And it's during this period, in the wake of the Six-Day War, that groups like Hamas and Hezbollah began to emerge.
Okay, so let's talk about these groups. In the headlines, they're often labeled as like, I don't know, militant groups or even terrorist organizations. But I feel like their roles in this conflict are way more complex than those labels suggest, right?
They are. Let's start with Hamas. Formed in 1987, they eventually take control of Gaza in 2007.
Right, and the U.S. and many other countries do consider them a terrorist organization.
Yeah, and their tactics, there's no question, can be violent. But here's where it gets complicated. They also govern Gaza. They provide social services to millions of people.
So it's this really tangled web of politics, ideology, and, let's be honest, just survival.
Exactly. It's never as simple as just good guys and bad guys. And I think that's one of the things that makes this conflict so difficult to understand, let alone solve.
Okay, so we've talked about Hamas, but what about Hezbollah? What's their role in all of this?
So Hezbollah emerges in Lebanon in the early 80s, and they're heavily backed by Iran. What's interesting about them is they have this kind of dual role, right?
Oh, go on.
So they have a militia, of course, but they're also a political party with seats in Lebanon's parliament.
So they're deeply woven into the fabric of the region.
Exactly. Which makes disentangling this conflict all the more challenging.
It's like trying to untie a really, really old knot. And speaking of knots, these groups, both Hamas and Hezbollah, they've both been directly involved in later conflicts that just kind of ratchet up the tension even further, right?
Absolutely. And those conflicts are vital pieces of the puzzle here, too. But we also can't forget about the attempts at peace, too.
You're talking about things like the Camp David and Oslo Accords.
Yeah. While they ultimately weren't successful, they provide crucial context for understanding the deep mistrust and the broken promises that continue to fuel the conflict today.
Right. It's like every time there's a glimmer of hope, something happens and we take 2 steps back.
Yeah, it's been a heartbreaking cycle.
So to sum it up, we have this long and complicated history of competing claims to land, deeply held beliefs, powerful groups with very different visions for the future.
And that, unfortunately, is the perfect recipe for the situation we see playing out today.
And that brings us to the heart of why we're doing this deep dive. You specifically asked us to really unpack the events of October 7th, the event that really set the stage for this latest escalation of the conflict.
Right, the Hamas attack on Israel, an event that, well, it really underscored just how fragile the situation is, and it reignited the debate about security, retaliation, and what a path forward could even look like.
And from the source material we've been looking at, this wasn't just your typical back-and-forth exchange of rockets. This was different.
Yeah, October 7th was different. This was a multi-pronged assault, like a coordinated attack by land, air, and sea, something we honestly haven't seen from Hamas before.
They really went all out.
They did. They launched rockets, yeah, raining them down on Israeli cities and towns. But what really seemed to catch Israel off guard were the commando units.
The ones that crossed from Gaza into Israel.
Exactly. They infiltrated Israeli territory, attacking both military and civilian targets. It was a shocking breach of security, and the death toll, I mean, it reflects just how devastating it was.
Over 1,200 people killed, according to our sources.
Right, and many of them civilians just going about their day. And of course, there's the added horror of the hostages taken.
Yeah, that's right. Over 200 people, their fate largely unknown. It adds this whole other layer of tragedy to an already horrific situation.
It's awful.
And given the scale and the audacity of this attack, I can see why Israel responded with such force.
Yeah.
So can you break down their strategy for us? Like, what exactly are they trying to achieve with this counteroffensive?
Because Israel's response, it was immediate. And it was overwhelming. I mean, they declared war on Hamas and launched a full-scale counteroffensive aimed at, well, dismantling Hamas capabilities and deterring future attacks. And they are pulling no punches.
We're talking about a lot more than just airstrikes here.
Oh, yeah. Think relentless airstrikes, first of all, targeting suspected rocket launch sites, weapons depots, command centers. But it doesn't stop there. We're also talking about targeting infrastructure, things like roads, bridges, even power stations, anything that they think, helps Hamas operate or function.
So a real show of force then. And looking at what's happening in Lebanon now, it seems like Israel is employing a very similar strategy against Hezbollah, right?
Absolutely. I mean, Israel sees both Hamas and Hezbollah as, well, threats cut from the same cloth, both supported by Iran. So yeah, their approach is strikingly similar. Neutralize the immediate threat through these targeted strikes, cripple their ability to operate by taking out key infrastructure, and just hope that, demonstrates the cost of engaging in this kind of conflict.
But as we discussed earlier, these are groups that are deeply embedded within civilian populations, so it's not like they're operating in a vacuum.
Exactly.
And the source material we have paints a pretty grim picture of the situation in both Gaza and Lebanon right now.
Yeah, it's a tragedy unfolding in real time. The civilian cost of this conflict is staggering. In Gaza alone, reports indicate nearly 42,300 Palestinians have been killed since the fighting began. And with Israel's recent ground incursion into Lebanon, we're likely to see those numbers climb even higher.
And that's the human cost. It's impossible to ignore.
And speaking of, well, heavy hitters in this conflict, we can't talk about any of this without talking about Iran, right?
Right.
Their involvement adds a whole other level of complexity, doesn't it?
It really does. Iran, they're not just a quiet supporter here. They're a major player on this geopolitical chessboard.
It really does feel like they're playing chess, but the board keeps getting bigger.
Yeah.
So help us understand, what is Iran's game plan here? What are they hoping to achieve by backing groups like Hamas and Hezbollah and now directly inserting themselves into the conflict?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, right?
Right.
On the surface, it's about countering Israel's influence in the region.
Okay, yeah.
Iran sees itself as a protector of the Palestinian cause and kind of a bulwark against, what they view as Western imperialism. But it's also about projecting their own power.
Right. They want to be seen as a major player in the Middle East and showing their military capabilities, like, with those ballistic missile launches into Israel. That's all part of that strategy.
So a show of force. But those missile attacks were also a direct response to something pretty major, right?
Oh, absolutely.
The assassination of Hezbollah's leader, Hassan Nasrallah.
Exactly. Nasrallah's death, that was a major blow to Hezbollah. He was a complex figure. Brilliant strategist, transformed Hezbollah from a militia into this really formidable political and military force. So, yeah, whether you agreed with his tactics or not, he was a force to be reckoned with.
It sounds like his loss really shook things up.
It did. And for Iran, it was personal. Those missiles weren't just about retaliation. They were a message to Israel, to the U.S., to the world.
Don't underestimate us.
Exactly. We're here to stay, and we're not afraid to use force.
Okay, so that brings us to this coalition of inclusion versus coalition of resistance idea.
Right.
From the source material, it seems like this theory, this framework, it can really help us understand, the broader alliances at play here, right?
Yeah, it's a good one.
So can you give us a refresher on how this theory works?
Sure. It's this compelling framework for understanding global politics, and it definitely applies to this conflict. The basic idea is that, that old Cold War rivalry between communism and capitalism.
Yeah.
Well, that's kind of given way to this new divide.
Okay.
And on one side, you have the coalition of inclusion. And these are countries that are embracing globalization, international cooperation, and generally, a rules-based order.
So like the U.S., Israel, many Western nations.
Exactly. And then on the other side, you have the coalition of resistance. And these are countries or groups that feel threatened by or excluded from that U.S.-led world order. They often see it as favoring Western interests at everyone else's expense.
And so in this conflict, you'd put Iran, Russia, and groups like Hamas and Hezbollah in that camp.
You got it. They're deeply skeptical of U.S. intentions and very critical of Israel's policies towards Palestinians.
Which actually brings us to another big point of contention in all of this. And it's something you shared some source material on, the International Court of Justice's recent ruling on Israeli settlements. It feels like this ruling really kind of threw a wrench into things.
It did. This wasn't just some abstract legal opinion. It had real implications. Essentially, the ICJ, they declared that Israel's settlements in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, they're illegal under international law. They argued that these settlements violate the Fourth Geneva Convention.
The one that prohibits an occupying power from, what was it, transferring its population into occupied territory.
Exactly. And this is huge because it lends a lot of weight to the argument made by many critics of Israel that, well, that their actions amount to a form of apartheid.
And that's a loaded term.
Absolutely. And it's so important to approach this debate with nuance, with sensitivity, with respect for the complexities involved.
Right, because it's not black and white.
Exactly. Israel vehemently denies the apartheid accusations, arguing that the settlements are about security. They say the situation is far too nuanced for those kinds of comparisons. But regardless, the ICJ ruling, it breathed new life into this debate on the world stage, which further complicates this conflict.
For sure. So we've got this incredibly complex history, competing claims to the same land, deeply held beliefs, and now this legal ruling that's adding fuel to the fire.
It's a lot.
It really is. So where do we even go from here? What does the future hold for this conflict?
Well, if I could predict the future, I'd probably be, on a beach somewhere sipping cocktails. But I can't. Predicting the future is a fool's errand, especially in a region as volatile as the Middle East.
True.
But we can look at potential scenarios, right?
Okay.
So the most optimistic outcome, although maybe the least likely, is a swift end to the fighting, like a ceasefire brokered by international mediators.
Okay, yeah.
That would, of course, save lives in the short term, but...
It wouldn't really solve anything long term.
Exactly. A ceasefire addresses the symptoms, not the disease, so to speak. A more sustainable solution, though, of course, much harder to achieve, would be a negotiated settlement.
To the broader Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Exactly. Imagine both Israelis and Palestinians, each with their own independent states, coexisting peacefully.
It's a nice thought.
It is. It's the two-state solution that's been discussed for decades, but, it would require immense political will and compromise, and honestly, that feels in short supply right now.
So if a ceasefire is kind of like putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound, and a negotiated peace seems like a distant hope at best, what's the alternative? What keeps you up at night when you think about where this could be headed?
Honestly, the nightmare scenario is a prolonged war.
Yeah.
With devastating consequences.
Yeah.
More death, more suffering, and the potential for this to drag in the entire region. And we can't forget about the question of Gaza. If Israel is successful in dismantling Hamas, who governs in their place? The Palestinian Authority, they're facing deep skepticism from people in Gaza, and there are concerns about what groups might fill that power vacuum. So it's a recipe for, further chaos and instability. It's really a recipe for disaster.
Yeah. So we're left with more questions than answers, and a conflict that shows no signs of slowing down. What's the final thought you want to leave our listeners with?
I think the key takeaway here is complexity. This isn't a conflict easily distilled into, sound bites or social media posts. It's about understanding the weight of history, the political machinations, and honestly, just the human cost on all sides.
Yeah.
It's about acknowledging that there are multiple narratives here, even when those narratives clash.
Yeah.
Because only then can we even begin to try to grapple with the really, really tough questions.
Like, what does a just and lasting peace even look like?
Exactly. And how do we build it amidst this deeply, deeply entrenched division? And honestly, those are questions I hope our listeners will continue to ask themselves, long after this deep dive is over.
I think that's something we can all agree on. Thanks for taking a deep dive with us. We'll be back next time with another topic you chose. Until then, keep those requests coming.